There's a trick Japanese factories used for decades that quietly rewired the brains of everyone who used it. And today, you'll learn exactly how it works. Have you ever opened your laptop to start something important and closed it 30 seconds later without doing anything? Have you ever known exactly what you needed to do and still didn't do it? You're not lazy. You're not broken. You're being sabotaged by a part of your brain that's older than language itself. And there's a Japanese method, used quietly in factories, hospitals, and monasteries, that tricks that part of your brain into surrendering. They call it Kaizen, continuous improvement. But that's the polite name. The real mechanism behind it is something much stranger and much darker. Before I show you exactly how it works, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and comment the task you've been avoiding the longest. It helps me understand exactly what you're struggling with. Let's go. Chapter 1. The Trap. The story I'm about to tell you happened to a man named Leo. Leo was smart. Leo had goals. Leo had a notebook full of plans he never finished, the pages filled with lists that started strong and trailed off into nothing halfway down. He wanted to write a book. He opened the document 11 times in 1 year and wrote 4 pages total, most of which he deleted the following week out of embarrassment. He wanted to get in shape. He bought the gym membership in January, the way almost everyone does, went twice in the first 10 days, and then paid for it silently for the next 10 months, the charge appearing on his card, like a monthly reminder of a promise he'd broken to himself. Every night he told himself, Tomorrow I'll start the chapter. Tomorrow I'll go back to the gym. Tomorrow the conditions will be right, I'll have more energy, more time, more clarity. Every morning, tomorrow became today, and today became nothing, and by the time he was lying in bed again, the cycle simply reset itself, patient and unbothered, waiting for the next tomorrow to fail the same way. Leo wasn't lazy. This is the part people get wrong about people like Leo. He worked 12-hour days. He answered emails at midnight. He was, by every external measure, a hard worker. But he was exhausted in a very specific and exhausting way. The exhaustion of a person who spends all their energy deciding to do things, and none of it actually doing them. The deciding was the labor. The doing never arrived. He tried motivation. He watched videos, read quotes, told himself this time would be different. The motivation lasted exactly as long as the video did. He tried discipline, the blunt force version, 5 a.m. wake-up routines, cold showers, strict schedules written in a planner he stopped opening by day 3. He tried accountability, telling a friend his plans out loud, hoping shame would do what willpower couldn't. Nothing worked. Not because Leo lacked character. Because he was fighting something he didn't understand, something older and faster than any plan he could write down. Not his schedule, not his willpower, his amygdala. And until he understood what that word actually meant for him personally, every attempt he made was doomed before it began. Chapter 2. The Ancient Trick. In the 1980s, Japanese manufacturing plants were dying. Toyota was losing ground to competitors who moved faster and adapted quicker, and inside the factories, engineers were burned out, resistant to change, quietly terrified of anything that threatened the systems they already understood. Management had tried the obvious solution first: demand bigger output, bigger transformation, bigger numbers on the board by next quarter. It failed. Workers dug in. Change felt like an attack, and people defend against attacks by refusing to move. So the company tried something that, on paper, looked almost too small to matter. Instead of demanding massive transformation, they asked workers to improve something by 1%. Not 10%, not double the output by next year. 1%. A single bolt tightened slightly faster. One motion on the assembly line made slightly smoother. A tool placed 2 inches closer to the hand that needed it. It sounds too small to matter. That's exactly the point, and it's the part almost everyone who has heard of Kaizen still misses completely. Here's what almost nobody explains about Kaizen. It isn't a productivity method. It's a survival hack for a very specific, very old part of your brain called the amygdala. The amygdala's only job, the one it has performed for hundreds of thousands of years, is to detect threats and shut you down before you do something dangerous. And here's the part that will change how you see every unfinished task sitting quietly in your life. Your amygdala cannot tell the difference between a lion crouched in tall grass and a large, vague, intimidating task waiting on your to-do list. When you think about writing a book, going to the gym for the first time in months, or starting a business, your brain doesn't calmly weigh the pros and cons like a spreadsheet. It fires the exact same alarm it would fire if you turned a corner and saw a predator. Freeze. Avoid. Survive. Do not engage with the thing that might hurt you. That's not laziness. That's biology performing exactly the function it was built for, just running the wrong software in the wrong century, on threats that were never designed to be physical. The Japanese engineers, without ever naming the neuroscience behind it, discovered something extraordinary almost by accident. A goal small enough, 1%, 1 bolt, 1 motion, is too small to register as a threat. The amygdala stays asleep. It never sounds the alarm, because nothing about a 1% change looks like a lion. And once a person is already moving, even slightly, a completely different part of the brain quietly takes over the task. A behavioral scientist who spent over a decade studying fear responses at a major research hospital found something remarkable when this idea was tested outside the factory floor. When a goal is deliberately shrunk below the brain's threat threshold, the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for planning, reasoning, and deliberate action, remains fully in control of the moment. There's no internal war. There's no negotiation between the part of you that wants to act and the part of you that wants to hide. There's just movement, quiet and almost boring in how little resistance it produces. Chapter 3. The One Push-Up Rule. Leo discovered this by accident, out of a desperation that had nothing to do with ambition anymore. He'd failed at the gym so many times, canceled so many memberships in shame, that the idea of committing to a workout filled him with a kind of dread before he'd even stood up from the couch. So instead of committing to a workout, he made himself a deal that felt almost insulting in how small it was. 1 push-up. That's it. If he got down on the floor and did 1 push-up, he was allowed, fully and without guilt, to stop. The first night, he laughed out loud at how stupid it felt, kneeling on his bedroom floor for what amounted to nothing. He got down, did 1 push-up, and stood back up. Nothing happened. No alarm went off in his chest, no dread, no resistance worth mentioning. Because 1 push-up isn't a threat to anything. It's beneath the notice of the part of his brain whose entire purpose was to protect him from wasted, dangerous effort. There was simply nothing there for it to defend against. But here's what he noticed by the 3rd week, almost without meaning to notice it at all. Once he was already on the floor, already in motion, stopping at exactly 1 push-up started to feel stranger than continuing. His body was already committed. The hardest part of the entire exercise, getting down onto the floor in the first place, was already finished, already behind him. So he did 5. Then some nights, 10. Some nights he genuinely did stop at 1, and that was fine. That was allowed. Because the rule was never actually about the number of push-ups. The rule was about breaking the freeze that had kept him off the floor entirely for 10 months straight. This is where most people misunderstand Kaizen completely. And it's worth saying plainly. They think the entire goal of the method is to always end up doing more than you planned. As if the 1 push-up is a trick to sneak in a real workout through the back door. It's not. And treating it that way defeats the purpose. The goal is to make starting so small, so unthreatening, so beneath your brain's radar, that your amygdala never gets the chance to build a wall in front of it in the first place. Whether you do 1 push-up or 50 afterward is irrelevant to whether the method worked. The method worked the moment you got down on the floor. Chapter 4. The Real Obstacle. But Leo hit a wall that the push-ups never solved, and it caught him off guard precisely because he thought he'd already cracked the code. His book. Writing felt entirely different from exercise, even though on the surface it should have responded to the exact same trick. It wasn't physical resistance holding him back this time. It was a quieter, colder fear. The fear that whatever he wrote would be bad, that the sentences would come out clumsy and amateurish, and would prove something about him he didn't want proven. Every time he opened the document, his brain didn't just resist the act of typing. It resisted the entire identity attached to the act. The idea of being someone who writes and therefore someone who can be judged for what they've written. This is where the second half of Kaizen's secret comes in, and it's the part almost nobody talks about when they reduce the whole philosophy to a motivational poster about small steps. Shrinking the task isn't only about physical size, it's about removing the judgment attached to the action, because judgment, not effort, is very often the true source of the freeze. Leo's new rule for writing wasn't write one sentence, it was write one bad sentence. That single added word, bad, quietly dismantled the actual threat his brain had been defending against. His amygdala had never been afraid of the physical act of typing. It was afraid of failing publicly, of producing something inadequate, even when the only audience for that inadequacy was Leo himself, alone, in a room, with nobody watching. A researcher who studies perfectionism and avoidance behavior, working with clients who describe themselves as chronically stuck, found a pattern that reframed the entire problem. People don't procrastinate on tasks, the research suggested. They procrastinate on the evaluation attached to tasks, the imagined verdict waiting for them on the other side of finishing. Remove the evaluation from the equation entirely. Give explicit permission for the output to be bad, and the resistance very often disappears along with it, because there's nothing left to defend against. One bad sentence a day, repeated without exception for 30 days, became 11 pages by the end of the month. Not because Leo suddenly became disciplined in some deep, permanent way, because he removed the one specific thing his brain had actually been afraid of the entire time. And once that fear was gone, the writing simply had nothing left standing in its way. Chapter 5. Compounding in the Dark. Here's where Kaizen earns its second, unspoken name. The engineers who built this system into Toyota's factories didn't just want small improvements for their own sake. They wanted improvements so small that almost no one would notice them happening. Because visible, dramatic change invites resistance. From the people around you who feel threatened by your growth, and just as often, from yourself, the part of you that panics when it senses a big shift underway. Leo's one push-up quietly became 5 minutes of exercise most nights. His 5 minutes eventually became 20. Nobody saw the exact moment it happened, including Leo himself. There was no dramatic before and after photo, no single Monday where everything changed. There was only a slow, almost invisible compounding, the kind that most people give up on long before it ever produces a result worth noticing. Because the early stages of Kaizen look, from the outside and from the inside, like absolutely nothing is happening at all. This is the part that quietly breaks most people who try this method, and then abandon it within a few weeks. Not the difficulty of the small tasks themselves. Small tasks, by definition, are easy. That's the entire design. The real difficulty is the boredom of doing something so small it feels almost pointless, week after week, before the compounding becomes visible enough to feel like progress. Most people quit in exactly this gap, right before the curve would have started bending upward, because 1% improvements feel like an insult to their ambition, a joke compared to the scale of what they actually want to achieve. But the factories that pioneered this method understood something the impatient mind never does. A 1% improvement, repeated daily without interruption, doesn't add up. It compounds. 37 days of 1% doesn't produce 37%. Left running long enough, it produces multiples. Because each small gain becomes the new baseline the next small gain builds on top of. The factories that survived the crisis of the 80s weren't the ones that attempted heroic, one-time transformations. They were the ones that stacked invisible improvements for years without stopping, until the gap between them and everyone else became too large to close. Chapter 6. Pre-solving the collapse. Leo's system, as good as it had become, still had a weak point, and it was the same weak point that eventually breaks almost everyone who tries to build a new pattern. Bad days. The days he was genuinely exhausted, sick, traveling, overwhelmed, or simply didn't want to. On those days, the old pattern tried to crawl back in, through the cracks, whispering the same old permission slip. Skip today, just this once. Start fresh tomorrow. It's just one day. So he pre-solved it, borrowing a principle from the same Zen monasteries that have kept their own practices unbroken for centuries. They don't make decisions in the moment a disruption arrives, because the moment of disruption is precisely when the mind is at its weakest and most willing to negotiate. Instead, they decide the response in advance, long before the crisis ever shows up. Leo wrote a single rule for what he started calling his collapse days. If I cannot do the version of the task I normally do, I do a smaller version of the smaller version. Sick in bed, one push-up performed lying down. Exhausted after a brutal day at work, 3 words typed instead of 1 bad sentence. The task itself was never allowed to disappear completely, no matter how bad the day became. It was only ever allowed to shrink, never to vanish. There was no decision left to make in the actual moment of weakness, and this turned out to be the entire point. The decision had already been made, in writing, back in a moment of strength, when his mind was calm and clear-headed enough to think it through properly. This single habit, deciding the fallback in advance, rather than negotiating with himself in real time, removed the exact moment where most people's consistency quietly dies. It's never the big obstacles that end a habit. It's the small, unplanned ones, arriving on an ordinary Tuesday, finding no pre-written answer waiting for them, and being handled instead by whatever tired, negotiating version of you happens to be standing there in that moment. Chapter 7. The Transformation. By month 4, Leo wasn't the person carefully negotiating himself down to 1 push-up anymore. He trained most days without any real internal debate, the way another person might brush their teeth without deliberating over whether it was worth the effort. He had 40 pages of a book he once genuinely could not start, sentences he no longer needed to label as bad before he was willing to write them. Nobody around him fully understood how he'd changed so much with what looked, from the outside, like so little apparent effort, because they'd never seen the individual steps. They'd never seen the 1 push-up, the 1 bad sentence, the 3 words typed on an exhausted Tuesday. They only saw the result, the accumulated weight of hundreds of 1% decisions, stacked silently on top of each other for months, finally becoming visible all at once. That's Kaizen's real secret, and it's the part that makes it feel almost dark once you understand it fully. It doesn't ask for your motivation, and it doesn't wait around for your willpower to show up on a good day. It bypasses your resistance so completely, so far below the threshold where your fear even notices, that you barely register yourself changing while it's happening. And then, one day, without any specific moment you can point back to, you look up and realize the person who used to close the laptop after 30 seconds simply doesn't exist in you anymore. Not because you defeated them in some dramatic confrontation, because you never gave that version of yourself a large enough target to defend. You don't need a bigger goal. In fact, a bigger goal is very often the exact thing standing in your way, because a bigger goal is precisely what your amygdala is built to detect and shut down. What you need is a smaller door, one so small your fear never even registers you walking through it. Start with 1%. Start with the version so small it feels almost embarrassing to call it progress at all. That embarrassment, strangely enough, is the proof that it's working exactly as designed. If this changed how you see procrastination, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. And tell me in the comments, what's the 1% version of the thing you've been avoiding the longest?